Hey, good morning. It's been a few weeks since we've done one of these.
Yes, and this time it's less. If you recall, last time you were looking at the rolling Santa Teresa hills in the back. Now you're just looking at some scrigglings on the whiteboard that your colleague Shankar had come and drawn, and I was super impressed with it. But again, it is super awesome, and we are lucky to have a guest who is looking so bright and cheery early morning, Roy Dirks. And Roy will introduce you as we have a dialogue, but welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Okay, Ed, what do we have today?
Sure. So, today we're coming back to one of our favorite topics, and I actually just think that pretty soon it's just going to be all MCP all the time on on
No,
our
we need we
podcast.
need we need agentic loops around it though.
Well, we probably do, but as you and I have talked about many times, at the moment, all paths seem to lead through MCP to any interesting thing you're doing. So we've been talking on various forms of MCP really since the beginning of starting this, and we're going to get even more into it now, and which is why we have Roy here. We're going to talk about GraphQL, which is also a topic that I think everyone on this call loves, having been very involved in it since the beginning. But yeah, and probably along the way we'll talk about a few other interesting use cases and things that we've been observing. But
Awesome.
I think you've been looking at stuff lately. It's the news cycles and such, right?
Oh yeah, yeah, of course. And clearly, I'm not at the receiving end of $1 billion pay package from Meta. That's all I can say. But if we ignore that, uh, the fact of the matter is that the one thing that kind of caught my attention was some researchers. I won't name the country. You guys can look it up, but it's not the U.S. Went in and fed all the LLM papers to AI. Okay, I don't know which model, probably the model that starts with D, and out popped new LLM techniques. Okay, and so it's clear that today we are at the cusp of kind of regurgitating human knowledge in kind of interesting ways to really possibly creating something new. And people talk about it in various hyperbolic terms, AGI, superintelligence, all that stuff. But I've been kind of reflecting a bit about what I do, and I was just kind of reflecting on the dialogue that we had yesterday, Ed, around how do you kind of monetize the wonderful open source stack that you're building. And it got me thinking, could that dialogue have been done by you with not me, but one of these agents who had been trained to be super intelligent? And then slightly self-serving, I don't think so, okay? Because we got into so many nuances and everything else. But it's always interesting for all of us to kind of just think through either how their job will change or what is it that they're doing that they think they're super proud of that machines will be able to do for them.
I mean, it's a great observation. I actually do often go after the fact. I try to not kind of precondition my thinking, but often sort of after a strategy discussion, much like the one we had yesterday, I do often go back to ChatGPT or what have you, and pose the same question and do a deep research just to sort of calibrate kind of, okay, here's what we came up with. Here's what would be perhaps the some might argue more linear predictive answer. And it's interesting to compare and contrast. So you'll find many of the same things, and then you'll find, either some parts that you didn't get into, because obviously, as humans, we probably follow more of the interesting lines of thought and certain, more important but pedestrian aspects of it get fleshed out for you in ChatGPT. And I think ultimately there's a synthesis of that, and I really do think that a lot of this is about building the user experiences for actually not having to do those in two tracks. Like I think essentially more of a of that assisted interface where perhaps things in real time are being brought into the conversation is more where people are gonna end up, and obviously a lot of the work and a lot of the reasons why things like MCP and so on are interesting is to try to support that type of informed
Yes. So,
co-reasoning, so to speak.
exactly. So for yesterday, we were having a general discussion on how to monetize open source, and there are obvious ways you monetize open source by either being open core or charging for
Cloud
support
or
and everything
yes,
else,
yeah.
right? And that's obvious, and I'm sure that if you went to your favorite LLM, it would come up with, look, these are kind of 2 or 3 ways in which you do it. But there was a lot of inside baseball discussions that we had yesterday, which is what's IBM doing in this space, what is our specific perspective and everything else. And there's no way, no how that any LLM would have that kind of inside knowledge. Now, of course, we also have, we believe we bring some intellect to it also, but that inside knowledge itself is something that says that how do you actually connect with things that are not just kind of common stuff. And therefore, what are IBM product plans, or what are IBM documentation, or what is Fubar, who's leading this project, what is her specific perspective? All of those kind of play into this kind of strategy discussion that we were having yesterday. And that cannot happen without connections to enterprise systems. And that is where MCP, for example, comes into play.
Yeah, I mean, it really does bring it full circle because in many cases that is the conversational details. If you're having the business planning process, well, how many people downloaded a piece of software last week? How many times did something come up in a conversation with customers? All of that stuff, when that is relevant and ready to the LLM process, now you truly get to the point where you're not sort of getting generalities, you're actually getting specific things that
Exactly.
that often accelerate the thinking. So I think that is definitely a great insight. If anything, actually, I feel like I feel a lot of those plans in general are accelerating in terms of things like recent announcements. Obviously, we're doing a lot of things with MCP, within the IBM product portfolio. I've seen lots of announcements. It feels like the MCP. Safe to say that the MCP hype cycle is. It does not feel like it's in any danger of running out of steam, right? I think we literally thousands. I just saw that stat of new product announcements with MCP adopted within them, which is again part of why we keep circling back to this, because some of the people may or may not know. Anant and I worked for a long time in the API and API management space, and I think the last time we saw this level of people rolling out REST-based APIs and so on into their systems was well over a decade ago, right? And it was an exciting point in interoperability without the payoff of LLMs and agentic use, and just basically widespread interoperability, which without sort of the overhead of previous mechanisms was pretty cool and drove a lot of the architecture we now take for granted. And so now within this, you're seeing a lot of major announcements. Obviously, pulling data in is a big part. I think we'll talk a bit about that today, and we're going to talk a lot about I think from an ongoing basis. It's part of our interest in MCP. And then, of course, one of the other pieces we'll also be talking a lot about is, the security component. I think one of the things that we've seen a few of them. There was obviously the the Supabase one a little while ago, and a bunch of others. It just seems every other day you're now seeing that a lot of these sort of very first generation MCP implementations is probably not fully thinking through the security and access control implications, and so we're going to see
Right.
a lot of that
Yeah,
as
yeah.
well.
Yeah, yeah. Exactly right. So, I mean, if you look at it, right, if you look at Roy Fielding, and for those of you who don't know, Roy Fielding coined the term called representational state transfer. I think that's right. Though Greg Braille may correct me because I may get it a bit wrong. Uh, and the idea really was that state is not really maintained on the server side. If any state that needs to be the clients kind of loop back with the state. But then in the early days of REST, kind of the standard protocols of get, post, put, patch, delete, etc. came about, and also kind of the header techniques of auths and bearer tokens and everything else. But it continued to evolve both in terms of syntax, in terms of how people would express with question mark query parameters, or with inline, and with something that Greg and Jacobson, etc., worried a lot about, conventions with respect to, is it customer slash foo or customer slash this, etc., etc. Right? So the meta point is that the direction has been set, doesn't mean that it will not kind of get tweaked around. I don't see kind of a different direction per se. I don't, exactly as you pointed out, I don't say that this is perfect by any stretch of imagination, but people will continue to kind of nibble at the edges and improve it. Hopefully it doesn't become too baroque, okay? But that's what I see in terms of parallels with REST.
Absolutely right. I actually do think, and I think we'll touch on this in the GraphQL conversation quite a bit, because I actually think that as opposed, so REST solved a lot of things by being very coarse-grained and very one-to-one on a lot of the entities or the assets that you were going to, and as a consequence, this is why people had to create things like experience APIs and such, which was that you needed a very direct relationship. And it's per the point that you were making, is it slash users or slash whatever. Like, the reason why those were important, a lot of people felt that was sort of in the weeds, but the reason was because your goal with REST was to really put the client in the driver's seat in terms of direct access to your various forms of data entities, which is ultimately what REST presented
Yes.
to you. And the problem was that represented, so that's the strength of it. The strength of it is great, like very, simple protocols succeed for a lot of reasons. The challenge was that at the same time that was happening was that you were looking at much more sophisticated application patterns, data access patterns than what the original REST was designed to do. And there were various ways of doing that. One is of solving that. One is sort of like the Google approach, which is going to say, let's keep the connections open. Let's parallelize a lot of requests and stuff, because what we really want to do is still continue to be very, very one-to-one specific. And then, of course, Facebook said, okay, if you were really in the business of delivering experiences that are compositional with data, you need a different approach. And and of course, this is something you could wax eloquently on for hours. But when GraphQL arrived in the scene, it was really on the idea that the experience is code delivered by a lot of
Yep.
processing that happens on the server side as well as the client side, right? Because the server is doing things based on the nature of your GraphQL request. If you squint just right, and actually we're going to squint more than just right in some of these conversations, a lot of what MCP does as well is about, particularly when we think about multi-agent MCP implementations, you're going to start to get into similar things where all the intelligence, the agentic loop, is not just over here in the client state. It's actually going to be leveraging and working with a variety of downstream resources, some of which will actually be further agentic in nature. And so I think that a lot of this thinking of these architectures is going to be developed over time, and that for me is really exciting in terms of both specifically how we use GraphQL, but also the lessons that came out of why was GraphQL created and so on. And so MCP already ends up having a foot in both camps. Like the REST purists look at MCP and they're like, in some cases they look at it and they say it does more than I would want it to. Whereas of course other people look at MCP and they say it doesn't do enough. And so for those of us, again, who have lived in the design of these protocols, we start to understand why that happens.
Awesome. Hey, Roy has been looking and saying, how does he look interested without getting engaged? So hey, Roy, before we get into GraphQL, I have always viewed you as the awesomest kind of developer who really understands how technologies that serve developers act and behave, right? And that is why we got a chance to partner for so many years. What is the developer view of all of this kind of techno geekness around MCPs and others? Is it rolling of eyes, or is it that's kind of gap? So how do you kind of approach it from not Ed and myself being kind of API providers and therefore this, how do you kind of come at it from the other side? And then we'll later on talk about GraphQL.
Yeah, so what I'm seeing as a developer, I've been building agents for the past, 2 years now. And you might start in a framework. The framework has a way to define tools where maybe you're writing Python or JavaScript or TypeScript or whatever you might be writing.
For you, only TypeScript, no JavaScript for you.
For me, it's mostly TypeScript, yeah.
Exactly. My God, you're such a bigot. Okay.
So the problem there is, assume you're building in framework X first, you build your tools, then you're trying to move to a different framework. You suddenly have to rebuild all your tools because the way they define a tool is slightly different from what other frameworks are doing. And then this makes it kind of hard to bring your code from one agent framework to the other. So this led to issues. And then it also makes it hard for vendors or for people building dev tools to create tools that were easy to use and reuse. So MCP is solving all these problems by giving you a way to take arbitrary tools and use them wherever you like, given a framework supports the MCP spec. But it also allows developers to just create tools that are being used by developers all over the world, instead of just their own little agent that they built.
Yes, but I remember initially you showed me kind of tool use in OpenAI, if I recall correctly. There was no MCP word out there, but it worked. There was that SERP tool that would go and look at the web, and I think that we had done some OpenAPI tool that you had built me, and you had showed me how it can be done. So all of it kind of works. What you're trying to say is that how you do it in OpenAPI may be different than how you do for Claude, or how you'll do it for Granite, how you do this. Is that what you're saying? Or is there something fundamentally now you can unlock some other ecosystem? I guess you're saying third-party stuff, etc. So what's really going on that will make your life as a developer so different?
It's really about reusability and being able to take tools from anywhere and use them in your agent framework.
Yes.
So the LLM has no clue if you're using MCP or you're doing tool calling via your agent framework. The only thing they see is a list of tool definitions, and based on that, they're going to give you a prescription of use these tools with these arguments. Your agent framework, however, is able to map these to MCP and then collect the results. So it's not so much about the models, it's mostly about interoperability between different agent frameworks. And then making tools once instead of making them 5 times if you're using different agents.
Interesting. I've got tons of questions out there, but Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking at that developer perspective, I think is super interesting. I'm curious as to how much MCP is changing things. Obviously, as you pointed out, Roy, people were using previous generations of this. People have been, using the various frameworks and so on. And it does seem like from a encapsulation of the tool use that it feels like what I see is developers seem to have. They're sort of straddling the line between going and saying, okay, I'm building the new stuff with MCP, but then they reach back for just more of sort of the direct coded approach. And so I'm kind of curious as to what you've been seeing, Roy, from your perspective are you seeing devs or yourself personally as you're doing this, are people going all in from an MCP architecture? Are they still sort of straddling that line? Like, where do you figure out, where do you do things via just sort of, the conventional tool injection and so on versus going and saying, let me actually, use the full MCP harness for pulling things in?
I feel people are going full in on MCP. If you would go to GitHub, you can probably find 15 or 20,000 MCP servers built by developers all over the world. And there's a whole range of startups that are making it possible to host these and make it even easier to start using these MCP servers. You also see a lot of duplication. So there might be 20 or maybe hundreds of flavors of MCP servers built around public APIs from companies like GitHub. So there's a lot of duplication out there still as well. But I see developers going all in for multiple reasons. They don't want to build tools themselves every time, especially not if it's a developer tool they're already using. And also they want to be able to switch between agent frameworks, because the agent framework that they like today might not be the one that they like tomorrow. And what MCP really enables them is having an NPM or a PyPy-like way to bring in code without having to rewrite, without having to connect to something they don't really control. So you get the source code, even though you don't really need the source code. Then what I'm still hoping to see is companies adopting or embracing really remote MCP servers, because then the source code is no longer with the developer, but instead the company would control what the API looks like. So that's going to be more interesting, and I think GraphQL is going to enable a lot of possibilities there.
So, and I'm glad you mentioned it, because that was the question was are NPMs going to are we going to see developers, and it sounds like you're saying it's already happening, we're going to embrace MCP the way that, for example, within the JavaScript, TypeScript community, you use NPM for everything. Like, in fact, there's obviously been a lot of criticisms because people will go and grab an NPM they'll install
Add 2 numbers.
Yeah, no, seriously, that's where I was going. It's like string concatenation as to, I mean, from one level, it's pretty funny, but on the other hand, it's sort of a, it showed that from the software reuse, the culture of reuse was, in some ways it's funny. It's like it ends up being sort of inevitable one way or another. You either do go to the package manager first, or or not, and when you flip it, of course, then yes, add 2 numbers and stuff. Those are sort of, but again, if you actually make the ecosystem really sort of packaged and reusable first, then those types of things are end up being consequences. And so that's been one of those questions within MCP is, and I've had this conversation with a few folks. In fact, Ananta and I were just having this yesterday, which was to go and say, is in fact the architecture of an agentic application really going to be effectively hub and spoke around MCP? Like, should we just, should we really just assume that most of the attached and integrated services are coming through some form of MCP? And it sounds like that's probably the direction that devs are going in, or if they're not already there.
Okay, hey Roy. So that brings us to the kind of the topic of the podcast, webinar, seminar, what I don't know. Of
We're a podinar, I think, or something.
Podinar. Is there actually a term?
No, I mean we that could be our other innovation.
That's another innovation. Though of course
Yeah.
I will ask my favorite LLM, what would he call it?
Yeah.
So GraphQL, right? Clearly, for every API, or in this case an MCP server that gets consumed to make the agentic application that Jill is writing better, somebody has to produce that, right? So the production side of it is as important as the consumption side. It takes two to tango, or whatever the expression is. So in that context, I see a huge number of people who have kind of invested in OpenAPI as a way of machine describing their APIs. Oh, by the way, Ed, I just came across 5 days back of some IBM internal system that had 9 different domains. And one of the domains, which I thought would be a smaller domain, had a 43,000 line OpenAPI spec. Okay, so we're going to we'll get to that later on. I actually lost a bet. I lost $100 because I was arguing with somebody. I said it cannot be more than 2,000. And I
By the way, I've heard of people who go and try to direct. There's some tools for taking your open. Obviously, we're going to talk about some of these, but old guard, old guard meaning 6 months ago, or pre MCP and such, where people would go and try to cram all of those into a single context, and it's disastrous, right? So hopefully, some of what we hear in terms of what we're going to talk about with this will address some of that.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So people are taking OpenAPI spec and using FastMCP or something and saying,
Yes.
whoa, now you got it. You got it. Low effort, instant ticky mark on MCP.
Yeah.
Roy, you have been pushing something slightly different, which is, look, don't just make it happen well. Okay? And for that, you want some layer where you can actually curate and subset and this. And that's where you have been kind of pushing on me and saying, Anant, think about really GraphQL at the center of this. So just kind of walk us through your thinking as to why you've reached that conclusion, or kind of reaching that conclusion, and the same arguments that you've had with me.
Yeah. So if we go back to why GraphQL was created, like more than 10 years ago already, it was two things. So Facebook needed a way to avoid duplication of their APIs between mobile and web. So people had these phones which weren't really able to have 4G or 5G or pull in a lot of data. So they didn't want to create separate APIs for separate applications. And then the other problem they had, of course, was the classic overfetching and underfetching, where they needed separate APIs because the web API was returning too much data for the mobile app to actually being able to parse and collect from the internet in a fast enough time to keep the users happy. And then federation of GraphQL APIs is something that didn't come into play later on. So Facebook has long been famous for having a monolith internally for all their APIs, so they didn't really care about federation. So that's a later point. But if you think about these two things, avoiding duplication between different applications and then reducing the amount of data that's being presented in each of these APIs, they're still very valid if you think about agents. If you have an agent doing one thing and another agent doing the other thing, they probably want to call the same APIs, but they don't need the same data from each of these APIs. And the way GraphQL enables developers to get control over the data they pull from these APIs is by having a query language that gives you the option to define which fields you like to see in a response and which fields you do not want to see. So if developers can use this, then agents can use this as well, because most modern LLMs, they have been trained on code bases which include GraphQL, so they're able to parse natural language to GraphQL and the other way around. So if you think about the OpenAPI example, if you have 43,000 lines of code, let's assume you have a couple thousand endpoints in there. If you would turn those into a MCP server, you would have 1,000 tools. Whereas with GraphQL, instead of having 1,000 tools for your entire API spec, you can reduce it to having a single tool, which maybe has a slightly bigger context because it needs to carry the API spec. But you don't have this all hard-coded, and you have a single tool that doesn't pollute the context window of the agent. So a lot of the reasons why GraphQL was created are still valid for agents, just in a slightly different setting, because we don't really care about bandwidth of your mobile phone anymore, but you do care about the number of tokens you consume. So if you get more data, you consume more tokens, it's going to cost you more money, and your inferencing speed is going down because the context window is increasing. So a lot of the reasons for GraphQL is still valid, given the need to reduce the amount of data, but also not wanting to duplicate your endpoints.
But there ain't no free lunch. So now some work has to be done by the people who are building that MCP server, right? So how do you kind of balance the fact that, yes, in some abstract things, doing it correctly matters, right? But in the practical sense, if there's a race to, I need to produce 200 MCP servers, why should I try to introduce a GraphQL layer? Let me just put it out there and let LLM worry about that stuff, right? So how do you kind of balance speed with doing it right, Roy?
I think it comes down to trial and error. I think people should definitely try to turn their OpenAPI specs into an MCP server, and I've found out if it works for them. I think it will work fine if you have a dummy OpenAPI schema. I think it will be harder if you have hundreds of endpoints in there. And then it comes down to abstraction. So the reason people are taking these libraries to turn OpenAPI into MCP is because it's easy. There's libraries that help them do this. But there are similar libraries for GraphQL that can help you do the same. And instead of giving you a fixed set of tools, you're going to get a flexible tool that you can actually turn into something that works well for your use case and works well for different use cases. Because instead of hard coding all the parameters and all the endpoints, you can get a flexible schema that you can tweak to your liking.
Let's talk. I think those are, and I think those are both. First of all, I think it's probably one of the most important questions, and I think that's a very, very solid answer. But I think, let's talk a little bit about sort of the failure mode, because this is what I see a lot of is when people try to do these. And as I mentioned, people even before Fast MCP, people were going and doing. Let me just take my OpenAPI spec and turn variants of it into into the tool definitions. And in fact, OpenAPI, their first implementation of their plugins back 2 years ago, took that approach. And so, first of all, it's just like rules of thumb, like if you are looking at double-digit amount of tools via FastMCP or whatever, you're going to need to
Curate it.
you're going to need to curate it, and you're going to need to start to think about this. And does it where do you end up? Do you do it through curation? Do you do it through GraphQL? Do you do it through other means? You're going to need to do something. So what's the failure mode going to look like? Well, the failure mode is going to be that you're going to see tools fail to trigger, right? So as a practitioner, this is what you end up having. You hear somebody going and saying, I asked this question 5 times, I can't get the tool to trigger, and obviously you try everything else, the model, you try to look at what are the descriptions that are being around it and such. But the reality is that as your tool complexity, both in terms of tool availability and parameter complexity, as well as the descriptions around it, start to increase. Remember, we go back to the name of this podcast, right? It's context window, right? So again, under the hood, no matter how sophisticated your agent is, it's sending, at the end of it, there is an inference call that has a big blob of text, maybe other data types too, but predominantly a very big blob of text that's going into the LLM in order for the generation to come out. And the bigger that blob of text becomes, the less likely you're. Seriously, right? Like I always like to explain it to people. I always like to remind people of that, because I think we always end up forgetting that at the base level, that inference invocation is a very simple function call, and so you will need to reason around it, and the result is going to be that, again, most common thing I hear is, I can't get it to use this this function. For the life of me, it's not. And then you start going and say, well, you're giving it 200 functions. Of course, it's a needle in a haystack problem that it should particularly find this thing. And so that's one of the things I see.
Absolutely. Okay. Hey, listen. A lot of talking heads. I think they're important. Roy, you've got something to show to us?
Yes, I can show you a little demo of taking a GraphQL API and then turning it into an MCP server, testing it using MCP Inspector, which is a very nice tool to test MCP servers and tools in isolation. And I'm going to put it in some small agentic loop just to show you that models are actually capable of working with GraphQL. I can start sharing my screen.
Well, I guess the GraphQL system that you'll use is StepZen that you and I worked on?
Yes, exactly.
Awesome.
So before I can show you what GraphQL and MCP look like, I need an actual GraphQL server. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take a simple REST API, which is from the Open Libraries. Open Library is a project from the Internet Archive to find books and all sorts of things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a CLI called StepZen, which is available in IBM as a product called API Connect for GraphQL. And this has a set of CLI commands that I can use to turn data sources like APIs or databases into a GraphQL schema, because I need a GraphQL schema in order to deploy my MCP server. So this is a URL from the Open Library. It's going to search for Lord of the Rings books, and then I have pagination in there as well. There's some small parameters I need to add just for some housekeeping.
Hey, we don't need StepZen import anymore?
I still need that, so thank you for calling that out.
Yeah.
Otherwise this would fill and I have to try it
What is
again.
this? I'm not just a talking head. I used to build some stuff too. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I'm going to do an import. I have a name parameter which will help me name the directory the GraphQL schema gets generated in. Then I can add a name of the operation that's being created. So we can call this search book. So this will be the name of my tool, actually. And then I can set a query type, which will be the type of my response for this tool. So I can call this book search. So what this does is going to send an actual curl request to this endpoint.
That's fast.
Yeah, it's really fast. It might take me a second or so. So it's going to generate a GraphQL schema. So let me start at the bottom, which with one field. The field is called search books. It has two parameters, the page and then the title, and then it maps to this REST API endpoint. There are different ways to map data sources to fields here. You can map to databases, you can map to different sorts of APIs. And then you can also see I have a return field. So one of the nice things about GraphQL is that you have control over the output. So you can see we have all these different fields. If you would be taking the single REST API and put it in an agentic loop, it means every time you call this tool, you're going to get all these fields. Like maybe you need some of these fields, maybe you don't. You're going to get them anyways. So GraphQL allows me to turn this into a GraphQL schema. And by getting the GraphQL schema, I now suddenly get a GraphQL query language that I can use. So let me deploy this using steps and deploy. So what this will do, it will make my data available
Wow,
in a
that's
GraphQL
also fast.
API, but also as an MCP server.
By
And to
default.
use it as, oh, go
By
ahead.
default. So it creates an MCP server straight out of the GraphQL API.
Yes, so by default, I'm going to get a GraphQL API and then an MCP server, which has a single tool. And the single tool allows me to query this GraphQL schema and return data from it. So I'm going to open the MCP inspector. Let me connect to...
Inspector is
My
something that Anthropic provides, right? Looks Postmanish.
So MCP inspector is part of the open source model context protocol org. So initially it was developed by people at Anthropic, but now it's being maintained by the open source community, really.
Okay.
So what I'm going to get here is I'm going to get a single tool, and this is a GraphQL tool. If you look at some of the input parameters here, it takes query and variables. So if you have used GraphQL in the past, you would need to send an operation to it, which could be a query, which is to read data. And you can also see the entire schema in here. So if I want to use GraphQL in here, I would need to actually type a GraphQL operation myself, which basically looks like this. So I can search for books. I call my field search books. I need a title. Let's say Lord of the Rings.
I knew that's what you'd do, man.
And then I need to define some return fields. So this does require you to have some knowledge of GraphQL. I might need more on my closing parameter there. And then you can see I'm returning data which is coming from my Open Library API endpoint.
Wow.
But you still get all the issues that Ad mentioned before. I just have a single field now. Imagine I have hundreds of fields. Then suddenly I need to do some curation. So in order to do some curation, you can actually, let me copy something from my other screen.
So right out of the box, you're able to import into GraphQL and create an MCP server. But now you've got that added layer that you can use to actually modify and make LLM smarter.
Yes, exactly. So this gives access to my entire GraphQL schema. What I actually want to do, I want to curate things a little bit. And I want to create a more specific tool that's just exposing a subset of my fields. So there's a way here to define your own tools based on all these different fields, because you might be building your GraphQL API to work with a web application or to work with any sort of system integration. But let's assume you want to take all those APIs you built for different use cases in GraphQL and you want to use them for an MCP world. Then you can use this custom directive called add tool to define a specific tool. And I can actually override my existing tools if I would want to. And here you can add a tool description, find information about books, all these sort of things.
Very good.
So I can basically iterate this for a number of different tools. So let me show you one other tool before I'm going to go into the agentic loop example. So I did this in a different project. I also took the Wikipedia public endpoint. So Wikipedia has a public API which allows you to search Wikipedia, and then it allows you to get specific results from a Wikipedia page. There's multiple ways to turn this into tools. What you could do is say, I'm going to take the search Wikipedia tool, and then we're going to take another tool to get a specific Wikipedia page. And in order to find maybe information about the authors of the Lord of the Rings books, I first need to search Wikipedia for the author name, and then I'm going to get in return a list of results, which includes a page ID, and then I can actually call a specific Wikipedia page and retrieve its contents. So this is one way to do it, and most of the agents are able to string together these different tools and get the result for you, which includes multiple tool calls. If you would be using GraphQL in this case, you can actually link the results yourself. So we can actually create a single field that searches Wikipedia, and then at the same point also calls this get Wikipedia page for each of the results. So there's two ways to think about creating these tools. It's either creating tools per endpoint if you have REST APIs underneath, or you can actually create your own tools which do multiple things at once without you having to write a lot of code. Because the only thing we're doing here is changing the GraphQL schema. So let me now...
So what you're showing is that you get lots of controls, right? It's not clear one size fits all. Small LLMs may want to write kind of individual tools, but larger LLMs are able to create and reason over more complex schemas, and therefore you may want to kind of combine, et cetera, and you get all of that flexibility because you've got that kind of GraphQL layer that allows you to either expose individual ones or expose them joined together.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly.
A few more minutes only. Roy?
Yes, so I'm going to go to a small agent. I have my MCP server in here. So this is the GraphQL API I created and deployed, now automatically available as MCP. So the same one we saw in MCP Inspector. It has two tools. It has the search books, which we created together, and then it has the search Wikipedia tool, which I briefly showed you. I'm bringing these tools from the MCP server in as tools for a small agent, which is using Llama 4 Maverick, all here in Langflow. So Ed can tell you all about Langflow, but it's quite an easy way to build agents, especially with MCP tools.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a handsome-looking open source tool that you're using there.
Yes, indeed. So what I'm going to do, I have my tools here. I have my agent with an LLM, and Llama 4 should be able to help me go from natural language to GraphQL. I'm going to open the playground where I have a previous chat just to use as a backup in case this one fails. Live demos are always good to do. So I can now ask a question like, show me books about Lord of the Rings. So if I send this request, I'm getting an error, so that's always fun. I don't know why. So let me just walk you through the previous example. So I asked, return a list of the Lord of the Rings books. I actually got a list back from the agent. So what did the agent do? The agent is looking at my list of MCP servers and their tools, and then it's going to decide to call a tool. And you can see it's calling the tool search books. So this is the same tool that we used in MCP Inspector. This time, the GraphQL operation is generated by the large language model. So you don't need to know anything about GraphQL. You just need to use a model that knows how to use GraphQL.
Very good.
And then you can see it's returning all these results, which are coming from my MCP server or GraphQL API, but actually coming from my underlying REST API that I imported earlier on. And then it returns this nicely formatted list. So the tools will return the data, and then the LLM is actually going to parse the data and display it to you here. Okay. You can see it's just returning the list of titles from these different books. So I actually asked a follow-up question. Now add the publication year and author. If we look at the tool calls again, you can see it's calling the same tool. It's using the same GraphQL operation, only this time it's adding more fields, like the name of the author and the first published year. Then if we scroll down, we should be seeing the data here. So now it's including the author and also the publication year. So just by using GraphQL, I'm now able to return to actually, well, not return, I'm able to control whatever is being put in the context window of my agent, thereby reducing the number of tokens being used, but also reducing the time it takes to generate this result.
Awesome. Hey, so can I just summarize? So we started this conversation with, look, we need to kind of curate the MCP server because just kind of throwing up everything is not going to work or not likely to work. and therefore we need some space in which we can curate. And it turns out that if there is a space called GraphQL, then that space allows you to kind of create tools, join tools together, expose separate tools, combine, do this, etc. And you can kind of add authentication. So it's a very nice place to actually do this. And you showed quite a few things that you could do within the context of GraphQL tier. But then the original question was that, look, if GraphQL has such wonderful properties, which it does, is it way too much of effort to get the advantage of that property? And what you showed, at least here, was that kind of simple import command, automatic MCP creation, etc., allows you to lower the barrier into GraphQL, but then you get all the benefits associated with it. And I know that, Roy, you and the team are working towards even further simplifying it, give an open API spec and bring it in and then curate and everything else. So I think that if we can get onto GraphQL, then GraphQL is the natural place to actually really define good APIs that can be exposed with MCP.
Yes, exactly. And what I always like to say is, like, GraphQL as a language, it's a declarative language, meaning it's easy to use and read for developers, but thereby also easy to read and use by large language models. So it's not, I would say it's not as complex as some of the open API schemas that I see out there.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, awesome. I saw that in one of the curly braces, the LLM had put a comma after the first one of the terms, which is really the right way to do it, because you don't know whether it kind of works or not works. So it was quite interesting. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Roy. So we are kind of running out of time, Ed. So how do you want to wrap this up?
Well, I mean, I think that this is one of I think that hopefully the takeaway on this is that as we walk through the different API technologies, so first of all, your MCP process is going to clearly be the primary tool in the toolbox for tying together these types of systems, right? I think that's part of our common point of view on all of these things. And then I think that once you sort of go to that assumption, as an architect, as a developer, as a practitioner, what hopefully people are doing is they see these things is to understand that there are a set of very mature technologies for being able to go and figure out how to go and pull these pieces of data or application access in to surface within MCP. And the thing that I love about this is that GraphQL is very powerful technology within the API space. That in seeing Roy's demo and so on. In fact, where I would actually think that we would even be able to go deeper is a technology that is uniquely suited for going and dealing with the types of problems which are entity relationships and really traversing and finding the right piece of information that are going to be directly related to the types of agentic tasks that we're requesting the agent to do, whether it's retrieving information or using that information in support of some sort of action. And so what I see here is that we've lowered the bar for using, first of all, using MCP in general, for using GraphQL in general, and using it as specifically within MCP, and that for me, what I personally am going to go and want to dig even deeper into is, now that I have this capability, how should I be revisiting GraphQL as a way of surfacing a lot of and unlocking a lot of the data that I want to use in these agents? And so I think if you're an architect or you're CTO that's looking at this stuff, it isn't just say MCP, 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 right? The whole world is doing that, but it's now going and making sure that you actually understand what are the whole set of integration choices that you have available to you. And one of the ones that has been very important, but I feel is now going to become much more important within this, is is GraphQL as the mechanism for doing it. So that was my takeaway on this, was that in many ways this elevates GraphQL pretty significantly within the set of choices that I should be looking at.
Awesome. I totally agree with you. There are a few other things, but another thing that I would kind of highlight, which didn't quite come across, is that not everything is a REST API in terms
Right.
of what you're exposing. You may have an OData interface. You may actually have a database. You may have a NoSQL database. You may even have a GraphQL API, right? And the question really is that in an enterprise landscape, your wish and desire that everything has a great REST API in front of what data you want to expose is never going to happen, right? It's never going to happen. And therefore, is there kind of a layer that on the north side allows you to kind of code and kind of optimize the MCP behavior, whereas the south side kind of handles all the variants, as opposed to you doing your own database MCP and you're doing this and that and trying to figure out authentication of it. GraphQL is a very good unifying layer out there as kind of the.
But it's the best exposure of the knowledge graph. I mean, again, in a very real way, an agent architecture is an agentic loop that's traversing a knowledge graph. And so that combination begs for GraphQL as the data exposure tier.
Awesome. And Ed, the only part that didn't work was that beautiful, good-looking Langflow stuff. I'm just kidding.
It was looking pretty good to me. It was looking pretty good. I looked at that and I said that thing must have at least 92.5 thousand stars on GitHub. It looks so good.
Okay. Hey, this is all good things must come to an end. We at IBM really believe in kind of developer-friendly agentic loops. You can write loops in your favorite agentic, both language but also the patterns, etc., etc. This is the first time I kind of heard React, which was different than the React that Roy had been kind of pushing on me, which was all the things dealing with JavaScript. But you can write that, but then how do you, and we've got, of course, some fantastic capabilities in Langflow that we were very lucky to acquire and foster the open source community around with the stuff that DataStax had done. But at the same time, how do you kind of take your server-side technologies and MCPize them? And we just fundamentally believe that the future architecture is an architecture built on well-curated MCPs with very flexible agentic loops written on top of it. And you'll continue to see IBM innovations, both in terms of open packaging for you all, but also enterprise packaging around it, including our products that you know. Okay, that's enough of kind of an peddling of IBM wares. Okay, we have got to kind of keep it neutral enough. But thank you very much. And anything else, Ed?
No, I'm looking forward to our next whatever we're calling these podinars. I'm going to try to make that a thing.
I love it. I love it.
But we'll get that schedule out there, and of course, folks, in the comments, if there's areas that you want us to address, please go ahead and suggest to us.
Awesome. I've got to get a mic. As it is, I look like a dweeb, and now I look even worse. Okay. Thank you, Roy, so much. You were, at least on my screen, you were between me and Ed, and it was awesome that I didn't have to talk to Ed all the time. I got to talk to you also, Roy. Okay, great. Thank you, folks.
Thank you for
everybody.
having me.